Vin Diesel arrives in a forgotten desert town seeking peace, but walks straight into a war zone. A ruthless biker gang called the Silver Fangs terrorizes a remote truck stop. Locals stay silent out of fear, and the authorities look the other way. Vin teams up with truckers and diner staff to stand their ground. Under the cover of darkness, a brutal battle for control erupts. A fearless community turns a simple truck stop into a fortress of resistance. But the danger hasn't passed, and the biggest battle might still be ahead. Stay with us to find out how this story ends, and don't forget to subscribe. More gripping stories are coming your way. Everyone knew him from big Hollywood hits. But few really got the depths of his personal resolve and the real-life skills he had refined away from the glaring spotlight. He grew up in a simple neighborhood. Vin Diesel had learned early on how to remain calm under pressure and handle tough times. Over the years, he had quietly developed a reputation for stepping in where others might hesitate. Most people just saw the smooth-voiced action star, but there was more to him, shaped by loyalty, discipline, and a deep sense of responsibility. Long before he landed roles that garnered millions of fans, he had crossed paths with people from every walk of life. Some were honest souls who found themselves in bad situations, while others were hardened operators who exploited any vulnerability they saw. Vin never discussed these personal experiences in detail, but he carried them like invisible medals, tucked away from journalists and paparazzi. Through success and fame, he remained quiet about his past for fear that prying eyes might misconstrue his actions or question his credibility as both an actor and a man of principle. That quiet integrity led him to an unassuming town in the American Southwest, far from the glamour of Los Angeles or the bustle of New York. Several months of intense filming had concluded, allowing him the luxury of a few weeks off. Instead of booking a lavish vacation, he opted for a solitary road trip to clear his mind. The hum of the asphalt and the open skies soothed him in ways that extravagant hotels never could. On that journey, he found a truck stop called Desert Edge, a sprawling place perched at a remote crossroads. The dusty sign flickered like a beacon of respite against the twilight, inviting weary travelers and cargo haulers to pause for coffee or sleep before continuing their long hauls. He observed from a distance the way the rig drivers navigated their massive vehicles into designated spaces and greeted each other with nods of familiarity. Inside a humble diner adjacent to the fueling station, a handful of patrons stared at the overhead television, which was muted but showed updates about local news and upcoming storms. The chatter was subdued, the air thick with the aroma of freshly fried food and the faint odor of diesel drifting through the cracks in the door. Vin took a corner seat and quietly ordered something simple, wanting to stay under the radar. His face was partially concealed by a well-worn baseball cap, and the staff seemed either uninterested in celebrity sightings or too polite to probe. A woman named Carla, whom he presumed to be the diner's manager based on how she calmly oversaw the staff, brought him a mug of coffee. She looked a bit tired, with a resolute but kind expression. He suspected the late-night shift took its toll on everyone there. As hours passed, he noted the flow of travelers slowing down. Night sank deeper, bathing the parking lot in an unsettling stillness. Big rigs lined the edges of the wide lot, their headlights off, only the occasional interior glow from drivers' cabs illuminating personal routines. The diner was about to close for the night, so Vin finished his coffee and stepped outside, inhaling the crisp air of the desert. The final whir of an engine signaled the departure of the last vehicle from the pumps, leaving him almost alone under flickering fluorescent lights. He had planned to sleep in his rental car for a few hours before continuing, but the calm was suddenly broken by the roar of motorcycle engines in the distance. The sound grew louder, reverberating across the open highway until it arrived at Desert Edge. Vin observed without immediate concern, attributing it to typical late-night bikers stopping for fuel. But the energy shifted when the motorcycles circled the premises instead of parking in neat rows, their engines revving aggressively. Several riders dismounted. They were clad in worn leather vests adorned with a snarling wolf insignia and an inscription in block letters that read, "Silver Fangs." Their presence exuded an undercurrent of intimidation, a sort of territorial claiming of the space. Some passers-by instinctively stepped back toward their vehicles. While Carla, still cleaning the diner's counter, paused to glance outside through the window. Vin noticed that these bikers were not casual travelers. Their stances suggested they had come to impose fear and perhaps collect payments. This was not the usual rowdy group that merely sought coffee and hot food. He remained near the diner's entrance, keenly aware of the tension that slowly enveloped the area. Though he had no desire to intervene in local disputes, he also felt uneasy ignoring a potential threat. Two of the bikers, a hulking figure with a shaved head and another sporting a jagged scar down his cheek, sauntered into the diner. Their posture was menacing, and Carla froze in her efforts to close up. Vin, unnoticed in the shadows near the door, watched them approach her. The atmosphere inside turned frigid. Each occupant of the diner, 2 staff members wrapping up the day's tasks and a lone truck driver finishing a late meal, sensed the threat. Carla appeared poised yet alert, as if she had endured their visits before. Without raising her voice or changing her expression, she signaled that they were about to close. The large man leaned over the counter, seemingly undeterred, and the second, the scar-faced biker, scanned the room with an arrogant sweep of his gaze. Vin studied every detail, from the tension in Carla's clenched jaw to the way the truck driver slowly put down his fork. Though no words were exchanged, it became evident that these men came to collect something, likely a fee for protection, or to reassert dominance over the establishment. Vin quietly stepped back outside, his instincts telling him that direct confrontation in a confined space could end badly for innocent people. He circled around to the side of the diner, looking through one of the narrow windows. From there, he observed the large man slam a palm onto the counter, rattling glasses. Carla held her ground, but no one inside seemed to have the courage to intervene. The tension built until the scar-faced biker signaled that they had made their point, and they strode out. Carla and the others breathed a collective sigh of relief. However, that relief was short-lived. The bikers did not leave the premises. Instead, they congregated under the station's canopy, their voices growing louder. Vin realized they had more in store, possibly for the truckers outside or even for Carla once she tried to lock up. He moved carefully around the back of the building, scanning for any vantage point that might give him a clearer sense of the group's intentions. Lights from the overhead fixtures flickered, revealing about a dozen motorcycles, each with the same insignia. Some riders remained mounted, while others dismounted to prowl around the trucks parked at the edges of the lot. One older trucker emerged from his cab to see why there were so many bikes nearby. He seemed calm but cautious, scanning the men for signs of aggression. The scar-faced biker approached him, presumably demanding something. The trucker gestured, and it looked as though he was refusing or simply did not understand the demand. The biker responded by forcefully striking the side mirror of the trucker's rig, shattering the glass. Shards scattered across the asphalt, creating a tinkling echo in the stillness. Vin understood that this was no random group. They had orchestrated this disruption to send a message. Under normal circumstances, one might call local law enforcement, but an unsettling suspicion arose in Vin's mind that the presence of these bikers could either be overlooked by certain corrupt officials or that the police response might be slow in such a remote location. He retrieved his phone from his pocket, checking the signal. It was weaker than in more populated areas, but he still managed to call the local sheriff's department to report an ongoing disturbance. The operator took the information, albeit somewhat uninterested. Whether this was due to understaffing or something more ominous, Vin could not tell. He ended the call and decided to remain in the shadows, observing. He wanted to step in, but he also recognized the unpredictability of armed bikers. The hulking man, evidently a key figure in the Silver Fangs, noticed Carla coming out to lock the front door of the diner. She seemed determined to secure the property. He advanced toward her, lifting a hand in a gesture that suggested he wanted to speak further. Carla paused, key still in the lock. She likely had no choice but to listen if she wanted to avoid additional property damage. Vin, edging closer while staying unseen, noticed how the surrounding bikers shifted their stance, as though preparing for a confrontation. In that charged moment, Vin recalled the silent discipline instilled in him from past experiences. He knew exactly how to defuse or control a situation if needed. But he also did not want to reveal himself prematurely, especially if law enforcement was on its way. He stayed close enough to intervene if Carla's safety was jeopardized. Then, in the distance, he caught the faint flicker of rotating lights. A single patrol car approached, which made the bikers glance at each other. Instead of dispersing, they seemed agitated. The car pulled up, and a deputy stepped out. The deputy's posture was tense, and after a brief exchange of uncertain gestures, the bikers began stepping back. Perhaps they recognized the deputy and decided not to escalate. Maybe they were confident that their message had already been delivered. The group retreated to their bikes. Engines roared once more as they formed a menacing line before disappearing down the open highway. Carla finally managed to lock the doors. The deputy entered the diner with an air of routine annoyance, as if he had been called to this scene many times in the past. Vin quietly observed from a corner. He saw Carla's relief shift into frustration, though she remained composed, providing the deputy with a terse account of the damage and intimidation. The night grew quiet once more, but an ominous residue lingered. Vin realized that this truck stop, and possibly the entire region, faced an organized threat from these bikers. Their approach was methodical: intimidation, property damage, and possibly extortion. He recalled that some outlaw groups also engaged in narcotics trafficking and other illicit activities, using remote truck stops as strategic nodes for their operations. He decided to rent a small room at the adjacent motel, the Desert Edge Lodge, to keep an eye on things. The motel was a modest establishment with a flickering neon sign. The room itself smelled of stale air and old carpets. Outside, the worn corridor overlooked the truck stop's sprawling lot. He stood by the railing for a while, scanning the darkness. No sign of returning bikers. The deputy's patrol car was still parked near the diner. Before turning in, Vin mulled over the events. He had come here hoping to find solace and anonymity, but life had led him to witness oppression and intimidation. As he drifted off on the creaky bed, he wondered about Carla's resilience and whether the local law enforcement could truly handle the Silver Fangs. Morning arrived with a brilliant desert sunrise. Vin woke early, stepping outside to see the natural light slowly revealing the dusty contours of the highway and the wide expanse of land. The diner had reopened, with Carla inside, her face betraying fatigue from the night's events. A couple of truckers occupying the corner booths seemed to be discussing the broken mirror and the tension from the prior evening. The rest of the staff carried on, trying to serve breakfasts and coffee as if it were any other day. Vin made his way to his car to check for any damage. Finding nothing amiss, he then decided to get some breakfast. Inside, one of the servers recognized him from the night before and gave him a subtle nod, as though acknowledging his presence during the confrontation. He remained polite but low-key, ordering simple eggs and toast, his cap pulled low. The local news played softly on an overhead television, detailing minor community updates without any mention of the late-night incident. The hush in the diner signaled that tensions had not fully eased. Customers ate quickly, mostly truckers passing through on their routes, eager to avoid trouble. Vin focused on his plate, mentally replaying the incident while evaluating whether he should leave or linger. Something deep inside told him that the problem at Desert Edge was not isolated, and that the people here might need more than a fleeting celebrity presence. His instincts were confirmed when an older man with a state trooper's badge entered, scanning the room for Carla. The trooper approached her, discussing details about the previous night's disturbance. Vin could read the trooper's troubled expression, noticing how Carla answered with quiet determination. She seemed to avoid mentioning that Vin had been there. He appreciated her discretion but also understood that she might want to shield him from unnecessary exposure. Over the next few hours, Vin ventured around the truck stop. He struck up casual conversation with some of the drivers who had parked overnight. He asked about the region, the roads, and whether they had encountered any problems. They hesitated at first, but one driver eventually mentioned that the Silver Fangs had been growing bolder in recent months. Another driver alluded to local businesses being forced to pay fees or face vandalism, and how the local authorities sometimes looked the other way. Vin listened carefully, gathering that the gang was part of a network that extended beyond simple extortion. These bikers might be cooperating with a more sophisticated criminal organization, perhaps involving narcotics or contraband flowing through the region. Truck stops were perfect choke points to press for payoffs or to coordinate distribution routes. The more Vin learned, the more it seemed that many were either too frightened or too resigned to stand against the Silver Fangs. As midday heat settled in, Vin decided to drive into the nearby town, roughly 30 minutes from Desert Edge. The road was lined with dusty landscapes, scattered cacti, and the shimmering haze that rose from the asphalt. Upon arrival, he found a small main street with a bank, a convenience store, a local sheriff's office, and a diner that looked older than the highway itself. The community appeared tight-knit, yet overshadowed by caution. Outside the sheriff's office, two local deputies conversed with a man who wore a vest resembling the style of the Silver Fangs, though with different insignia. Vin surmised that multiple biker groups might exist in the area, some perhaps at odds with each other, while others might be in temporary alliances. He observed from a short distance before entering a nearby general store to buy a few supplies. Inside, the clerk was friendly enough, but when Vin subtly steered the conversation toward the Silver Fangs, the clerk's expression became guarded. It was clear that most residents were reluctant to talk openly. Returning to Desert Edge later that afternoon, he saw Carla arguing in hushed tones with two new bikers parked near the diner. She appeared distressed, rubbing her temples as if coping with a headache. The bikers revved their engines before departing, leaving Carla standing at the entrance. Vin approached, and though he avoided direct conversation, he could sense her frustration and fear. The cycle of intimidation was continuous. Late that evening, Vin found himself at the motel again, scanning the horizon for trouble. The night air carried a stillness mixed with the hum of insects. He recalled episodes from his past when he had quietly intervened to protect vulnerable people from predatory gangs. His training in those earlier years, though far less glamorous than his film roles, had equipped him with situational awareness and the ability to handle danger efficiently. He understood that sometimes a direct confrontation was needed, but only when precise and necessary to avoid unintended fallout. Around midnight, a series of motorcycle engines disrupted the silence once again. This time, the group seemed larger. Headlights cut through the darkness, and the bikes formed a line just beyond the gas pumps. A wave of apprehension coursed through the property, causing a few truckers to step out of their rigs to see what was happening. Lights inside the diner turned off, as the staff likely tried to avoid drawing attention. Vin left his room and stood in an unlit section of the motel corridor. He discreetly assessed the scenario. A lean man with a bandana that bore the Silver Fangs insignia dismounted his bike. Others flanked him, each scanning the premises like enforcers on a mission. Their collective presence hinted at something more serious than a casual stop. They appeared ready to make an example of someone or something. He noticed Carla peering from behind the diner's door. One of her employees seemed to stand next to her, obviously worried about what might unfold. Then, the lead biker pointed toward a line of trucks, as though identifying a target. The group sauntered in that direction, their footsteps echoing. A short distance away, an older driver named Rudy had just finished dinner and was preparing to get some rest in his cab. He noticed the bikers approaching his truck. Though no direct words were spoken, the confrontation was obvious. They wanted him out of the truck or they wanted something he could not provide. From his vantage point, Vin saw the tension escalate as the lead biker gestured threateningly. Rudy hesitated, uncertain whether to comply. Vin weighed his options carefully. He could rush in and create a distraction, but a large group of armed bikers was no trivial obstacle. Alternatively, he might wait for local law enforcement to show up again, though that had proven less than reliable the night before. The best immediate move, he decided, was to ensure no one was seriously harmed. He slipped into the shadows near Rudy's truck. The older driver was stepping down from his cab when the leader of the Silver Fangs grabbed him by the collar and seemed to demand answers or payment. Rudy, though robust from years of trucking, was clearly outmatched. Another biker circled behind him, blocking any escape. Vin, keeping to the darkness, edged closer, heart pounding with calculated resolve. He had no intention of revealing himself as some cinematic hero, but he also could not stand by. He grabbed a small tool from his pocket, something that could discreetly create a distraction, and lobbed it a short distance to strike a metal pole, causing a clang that echoed across the lot. The bikers momentarily released their grip on Rudy to see where the noise originated. In that brief window, Rudy managed to scramble back into his cab, slamming the door. The leader barked silent fury through his gestures, instructing two underlings to investigate the source of the noise. They prowled toward the corner of the motel, scanning the dimly lit area for any sign of movement. Vin stayed hidden, forcing his breathing to remain even. He felt the dryness of his mouth, the tension coiling in his limbs. He had to be patient. A distant siren interrupted the standoff. Its wail carried across the desert, faint but approaching. The Silver Fangs recognized the siren as a call to retreat or risk a more confrontational standoff with law enforcement. They quickly regrouped, straddling their bikes and barking silent commands at each other. Engines revved again, and they took off, leaving only the hiss of wind and the receding echo of motorcycles along the highway. Rudy remained locked in his cab, visibly shaken, while Carla and her employee peered from the diner. The siren grew closer, revealing another patrol car pulling into the lot. Vin exhaled, relieved no one had been seriously injured but knowing this pattern would likely repeat. The question was how to break it. By the time the deputy arrived, the bikers were gone. Rudy slowly climbed down, explaining in hushed tones that he had narrowly avoided harm. The deputy's frustration was evident. He asked for details, but Rudy could not identify the men beyond their vests. Carla provided a summary of the group's repeated harassment. The deputy seemed sympathetic yet powerless, referencing limited manpower and the need for further investigation. Vin retreated to his motel room, pondering what it would take to dismantle or deter the Silver Fangs. He recalled the stories of infiltration he had heard from old friends, how a determined group could gather intelligence and coordinate with the right agencies to tackle criminal networks. He also understood that local residents, united in purpose, could become a formidable barrier against intimidation. The question was whether fear had already eroded that unity. When dawn broke, Vin quietly packed his bag, though he was not planning to leave. Instead, he checked into the motel for another night, ensuring no suspicion arose that he might be someone with a deeper agenda. He spent the day in quiet observation, occasionally helping Carla move boxes of supplies when the diner received a shipment. He noticed the gratitude in her eyes, even though she spoke no words of thanks. She seemed to sense that he was more than a passerby. As he carried a stack of crates, Vin spotted a dusty notice board near the diner's entrance. It contained outdated flyers about community events and a small poster about a local veterans group. He paused, reflecting on the possibility that there might be experienced individuals in the area who would not hesitate to defend their neighbors if properly organized. During lunchtime, a handful of truckers discussed routes, mechanical issues, and updates on a rumored crackdown on illegal cargo across the region. Some mentioned that certain companies had grown reluctant to send their trucks through these parts, worried about sabotage or biker intimidation. Carla's diner, once a bustling rest stop, had lost business. The tension was palpable in every aspect of the daily routine at Desert Edge. Vin spent the afternoon speaking briefly with the local deputy who had responded multiple times. He learned that the small sheriff's department covered a vast area with limited resources. The deputy admitted they had multiple investigations related to the Silver Fangs, but convictions were rare, partly because many victims refused to testify, fearing retaliation. Vin asked whether any state or federal agencies had taken interest, and the deputy hinted that there might be a special task force, but details were scarce. At dusk, the desert sky flared with color. Vin stood outside, scanning the horizon. He suspected that the Silver Fangs would continue their harassment, possibly with more force if they felt threatened or challenged. So far, they had only tested the waters, flexing power through intimidation and minor destruction. However, extortion and violence often escalated if the criminals believed they could act without significant pushback. His intuition proved correct when, just after sundown, another cluster of motorcycles appeared, lighting up the deserted highway with high beams. This time, the group seemed more numerous, and there was a tension in their formation that suggested readiness for a bigger confrontation. They rode onto the truck stop property with minimal regard for any watchers, as if they assumed no one would dare intervene. Carla, noticing them arrive, quietly began closing the diner. Several truckers who had planned to dine there quickly settled their bills and exited, some glancing around uneasily. Vin stood in the shadows near the motel steps, prepared to intervene if the bikers threatened anyone directly. The leader of this new wave seemed different from the scar-faced enforcers who had appeared before. He had a quieter aura, the kind that exuded confidence without needing to grandstand. Vin deduced he was higher up in the gang's hierarchy. The man walked around, scanning the trucks and eventually heading toward the diner's back entrance. A couple of his men fanned out, evidently searching for Carla or anyone who might resist. Inside the diner, lights were off except for the glow of the kitchen area. Carla and one younger staff member were gathering their belongings, hoping to avoid a direct confrontation. From outside, Vin perceived the subtle shift in the men's body language as they drew closer, stepping with purpose. Fear was an effective tool for them, and they intended to wield it. Vin felt that time was running out for passive observation. The situation had escalated, and a message needed to be sent to the Silver Fangs, that their intimidation would no longer be tolerated at Desert Edge. He scanned the environment for anything that could tip the scales. He spotted the same state trooper from earlier in the day. Just pulling up near the gas pumps, probably responding to a tip from Carla. Yet the trooper was alone, and these bikers numbered at least 9 or 10. A wave of tension swept across the truck stop. The trooper stepped out, placed a hand on his holster, and seemed to caution the bikers from approaching the diner. The leader of the group remained calm, gesturing with a slow, deliberate motion that indicated a possible standoff rather than an immediate brawl. The trooper radioed for backup but likely knew it could be a considerable wait before more units arrived, given the vastness of the county. Vin slid behind a nearby trash enclosure, positioning himself to observe. He considered stepping forward to assist the trooper, but he also knew that an overt move might turn the scene into chaos, potentially endangering Carla and the staff. The Silver Fangs leader signaled 2 men to circle around, presumably to corner anyone inside the diner. The trooper tried to block them, but without immediate backup, his position was precarious. This was the moment. Vin decided to make a calculated intervention. He picked up a piece of metal pipe lying near the trash and threw it into the path of the circling bikers, causing them to stumble and look back. Then, staying low, he moved around the far side of the building, hoping to divert the group's attention away from the diner's entrance. In the confusion, the trooper gained a momentary advantage, commanding the bikers to stay where they were. The leader locked eyes with the trooper, and time seemed to slow. A single misstep now could spark an all-out melee. The mood was electric, a hair's breadth away from violence. Carla remained inside the diner, likely peeking through the window, uncertain if she was about to witness a firefight. Suddenly, a second patrol car roared onto the lot, lights flashing. The Silver Fangs leader assessed the changed situation, realizing that tangling with multiple officers could lead to arrests. He and his men backed away from the diner door, glaring at the trooper who had stood his ground. Engines fired up again, and within seconds, the bikers sped off into the darkness, leaving behind a swirl of tension and confusion. The troopers took statements from Carla, her employee, and the few truckers who had remained. No one could provide a clear description of the men, aside from their general appearance and the Silver Fangs patches on their vests. Vin slipped back to the motel, staying out of the official narrative to avoid drawing attention to himself. He remained restless throughout the night, perched in his motel room, considering how the situation might escalate further. He was certain that the Silver Fangs would not merely vanish. They would regroup, possibly bringing more allies, or they might shift tactics by targeting vulnerable individuals. If local law enforcement was overstretched, and if the gang had connections in the region, the question was not if a showdown would occur, but when. This steady stream of aggression signaled a deeper plan. Vin sensed that the Silver Fangs might be preparing to expand their influence, turning Desert Edge into a hub for illicit trafficking. The repeated harassment at the truck stop was meant to weaken resistance, ensuring that no one dared to stand in their way. Carla's Diner, a common gathering place for drivers from all over, was an ideal location to maintain a watchful presence. If the gang dominated Desert Edge, they could control significant routes in and out of the southwest region. By dawn, Vin had decided on a course of action. He would subtly rally the truckers, the employees, and anyone else who was tired of living in fear. He would gather information that might prove critical for a larger intervention. He also intended to make contact with any local veterans groups that could offer support. While the sheriff's department and state troopers did their best, they were outnumbered and hampered by a lack of resources. His first step involved approaching Rudy and some other truckers he had seen multiple times at the stop. He casually brought up the dangers of the area, hinting that solidarity could at least deter random intimidation. Many of these individuals had served in the military or had families they needed to protect, so a common protective instinct lay just beneath the surface. Vin wanted to tap into that sense of community. Carla quietly confided in him, through subtle gestures and guarded words, that some local business owners were already collaborating to exchange warnings about Silver Fangs sightings. They used shortwave radios and discreet text messages, forming a small but determined network. Vin saw that if this network gained structure, it could become a formidable deterrent. He also recognized the potential for infiltration by a higher-level criminal element. The Silver Fangs might be linked to a larger syndicate operating across state lines. There were whispers of a figure named Santiago, who allegedly oversaw multiple biker factions. No one knew for sure if he existed or if the name was simply a rumor spread to maintain fear. Nevertheless, Vin started to collect whatever bits of information he could. He observed the bikers' comings and goings, noting license plates, times of arrival, and possible supply runs. When the local deputies visited the diner for coffee, he eavesdropped on updates, gleaning that the sheriff's office had limited intelligence. They lacked the manpower or specialized training to mount an effective counterstrike. Midweek arrived with an oppressive heat. Desert Edge seemed subdued, as if the entire region was holding its breath. Truck traffic thinned, and Carla's Diner served fewer customers, likely due to the growing reputation that something was off in the area. People were reluctant to stop where gangs might lurk. At dusk, a meeting took place near the rear of the truck stop, in a patch of gravel behind a row of tractor-trailers. Vin had initiated discreet talks with a few truckers, most of them older, some rumored to be veterans, and even a couple of local workers who were fed up with the bikers' threats. Over the sounds of distant generators humming, they discussed forming a watch group. The plan was not to launch an armed conflict but to create a visible deterrent and gather better evidence. They needed a rotation of observers who could document suspicious activities and quickly alert each other and the sheriff's department. Vin agreed to help coordinate these efforts, using the organizational instincts he had honed in earlier life experiences that he rarely spoke about. As the group quietly dispersed to avoid drawing attention, Vin felt a renewed sense of purpose. He understood the gravity of the situation. The Silver Fangs were likely part of a larger machine that thrived on fear and corruption. But from small acts of resistance could grow the kind of momentum that toppled entire criminal networks. Late that night, he stood under the buzzing streetlight near the motel, scanning the highway. Somewhere in the distance, headlights flickered and faded, perhaps another set of bikers or just a lone trucker carrying freight through the desert. Vin felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He was an outsider here, a Hollywood star with no official authority. Yet he possessed something far more valuable, the will to act and the capacity to inspire others not to yield to fear. He left a message for an old acquaintance in law enforcement, carefully encoded so as not to divulge too many details if intercepted. He knew that if the situation escalated, the local sheriff's department might need backup from a higher jurisdiction or specialized units. In the meantime, the best he could do was keep watch, help the community organize, and anticipate the next move by the Silver Fangs. The next evening, a disturbing development shook Desert Edge. A group of men who identified themselves as infrastructure inspectors arrived, sporting official-looking badges. They announced that they needed to examine the diner's structural compliance and the motel's safety features. Carla and the motel manager were puzzled because no official inspection had been scheduled. The men, however, insisted on their right to enter various parts of the properties. Vin watched from a distance, noticing that at least two of the supposed inspectors had the same subtle tattoos he had glimpsed on certain Silver Fangs members, though now hidden beneath collared shirts. Their presence suggested a new tactic, infiltration under the guise of authority. If they gained free rein to roam, they could plant contraband or sabotage the diner and motel. Carla reluctantly led one man through the diner's kitchen, while the motel manager took another around the back corridors. Vin quietly followed, staying far enough behind not to arouse suspicion. During their so-called inspection, the men took photos and notes. Their focus seemed less about building safety and more about vantage points, security cameras, and possible entry/exit routes. Vin recognized it as reconnaissance for a more thorough operation. When they finished and vanished into the scorching afternoon heat, Carla expressed her confusion about the abrupt visit. The motel manager was equally baffled. Vin hypothesized that the Silver Fangs might be preparing a more sophisticated plan, possibly involving sabotage or forced shutdown of the diner if the property could be declared unsafe. By posing as inspectors and filing false reports, they could create financial and legal burdens that might drive Carla and the motel owner to pay extortion fees or abandon the place entirely. Vin sensed that the final confrontation was on the horizon. The Silver Fangs had tested local resolve through intimidation, property damage, and now infiltration. If they were emboldened by a larger network, they might soon attempt a takeover. He also suspected that they had a timeline, perhaps correlating with a major trafficking operation. The truck stop's strategic location made it an ideal waypoint. Evening brought the usual hush, only to be shattered again by the familiar rumble of motorcycle engines. But this time, it was not a small group or even a moderately sized one. The entire lot seemed to vibrate with the sound of multiple bikes arriving in formation. Their headlights cut swathes through the desert darkness, revealing more riders than Vin had seen before. The local watchers he had organized were alerted through a quick flurry of text messages. From his vantage point near the motel, Vin counted at least 20 riders, possibly more, rallying in the open space between the pumps and the diner. Their posture suggested they were awaiting someone of significant rank. As they idled, the leader from the previous night suddenly appeared, flanked by two men in suits, an unusual sight among leather-clad bikers. Vin realized these suits could be part of the extended criminal enterprise, possibly high-level facilitators or corrupt officials. Every nerve in Vin's body screamed that a pivotal moment was at hand. He quietly moved to a vantage point behind a line of parked trucks. He could sense that the watchers he had organized were also discreetly in position, cameras and phones ready to capture evidence. Carla and her employees secured themselves inside the diner, lights dimmed, doors locked. The conversation among the biker leader, the suits, and the others was inaudible from Vin's position, but their gestures and mannerisms conveyed tension. One of the suited men pointed toward the diner, then toward the trucking area. The bikers nodded, as though receiving orders. The second suited individual showed something on a tablet, possibly a map or a set of instructions. Within minutes, the group split. Several bikers approached the diner, while another contingent moved toward the row of trucks. The watchers braced themselves. Vin could feel the air crackle with the possibility of violence. If the gang targeted the diner or forced their way in, the watchers would be compelled to step in, or at least document enough evidence to ensure law enforcement had cause to intervene. Suddenly, the rumble of multiple engine brakes announced the arrival of other trucks. Vin was not sure if they were random arrivals or allies responding to the watch group's quiet call. It turned out to be a mixture. Some were standard freight haulers, while others were driven by men who had exchanged numbers with Vin, prepared to stand against intimidation. The parking lot filled with the heavy presence of diesel engines and air brakes, overshadowing the sound of motorcycles. A standoff was unfolding. On one side, the Silver Fangs and their mysterious associates. On the other, a growing circle of trucks and watchers who were tired of ceding ground. The tension soared. State troopers would likely respond, but if the bikers triggered a violent encounter now, it could spill into chaos before reinforcements arrived. Vin carefully observed each movement. He sensed that the suits were gauging whether to push forward or retreat. The watchers, though determined, were not a trained militia, but their sheer numbers and the physical size of the trucks provided a solid barrier. The bikers revved their engines threateningly, hoping that intimidation alone would cause the watchers to scatter. Yet the watchers held their positions, capturing footage with their phones. In that moment, the quiet defiance of ordinary people stood in stark contrast to the orchestrated menace of the Silver Fangs. The suits exchanged glances. Then the leader, scowling, made a curt motion with his hand. One by one, the bikers withdrew, returning to their formation near the entrance of the lot. The large group hesitated, as if waiting for final orders. After a tense pause, they revved their bikes and thundered away into the desert night, leaving behind the echo of muffled curses and unfulfilled threats. No one cheered. The watchers knew that this showdown, though momentarily diffused, was not the end. The suits had gathered data, possibly gleaning the identities of those who dared to resist. The Silver Fangs would bide their time, regroup, and strike again, perhaps more viciously. Vin realized that the next battle might not be a standoff, but a calculated assault on individuals. He returned to his motel room, phone in hand, typing out an urgent message to his contact in law enforcement. He included details about the suits, the approximate number of bikers, and any license plates that watchers had recorded. If any agency was to intervene effectively, they needed a clear picture of how serious this operation was. As the dust settled and the engines faded, Desert Edge braced for the fallout. Carla stepped outside briefly, acknowledging the watchers with a somber nod. The tension was palpable, but there was also a newfound unity among those who refused to remain silent. Vin sat on the edge of his motel bed, replaying every moment and detail in his mind. He understood that the Silver Fangs operated like a paramilitary group, disciplined in their intimidation tactics. Yet he also believed that unwavering determination, coupled with the right evidence and strategic pressure, could expose the entire network. The story unfolding here at Desert Edge was no simple matter of local thugs. This was an entrenched criminal enterprise that might span states or even nations. He closed his eyes momentarily, reflecting on his career, the roles he had played on screen, and the real challenges faced by communities like this when the cameras were off. He thought about how many people felt powerless against such threats. But he also thought about how the seeds of resistance had been planted. By the next dawn, he vowed to rally further support, coordinate with more truckers, and strengthen the information pipeline to external law enforcement. Little did he know that the Silver Fangs and their backers had decided Desert Edge was too strategic a location to leave uncontested. Their next plan would be larger in scope, possibly involving sabotage, infiltration of local government, and the neutralization of key resistors. Vin sensed the storm was only beginning, but he also felt a deep resolve to ensure that the quiet courage of ordinary people would not be trampled by the greed and brutality of an outlaw gang. He set his phone on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling, hearing the faint rumble of distant engines. The desert night had grown still, but within that stillness, a battle was brewing, one that would test every ounce of determination he and the desert community could muster. He remained awake in the quiet motel room, revisiting the events of the night that had just passed. The Silver Fangs had come in large numbers, led by men in suits who appeared to give orders. But they had ultimately withdrawn upon encountering unexpected resistance. Now, in the early morning stillness, the parking lot of Desert Edge sat under a pale desert sun, revealing the scarred concrete where motorcycle tires had scraped the surface and the faint outlines where some of the trucks had formed a barrier. A residue of tension remained, more subtle than before, yet no less real. As he stepped into the open air, Vin Diesel inhaled the arid breeze. He noticed changes that spoke to the growing anxiety. Carla had not yet opened the diner, even though sunrise usually signaled her routine preparation for breakfast. The building sat with its blinds partially drawn, as if bracing for an unwelcome visit. A few truckers, many of whom had participated in the silent standoff, looked on from their cabs. They waited for some sign that the danger had passed. An older driver, who had been instrumental in rallying others the previous night, approached Vin quietly. He carried the weight of someone who had seen too many situations escalate, whether in foreign wars or domestic disputes. He hinted that several watchers had captured video clips and blurry photos of the bikers' formation, as well as the suits who guided them. The watchers wanted to share this material with the authorities, hoping that the official records might finally trigger a more resolute response. Vin encouraged him to proceed carefully, knowing that disseminating such evidence could place targets on their backs. He wandered the perimeter of the truck stop, scanning the dusty edges of the property for anything that might have been left behind. A glint caught his eye near the row of fuel pumps, and he crouched to retrieve a small metallic device no larger than a matchbox. It seemed like a tracker or listening gadget, possibly dropped by the suits or their associates. Even if it turned out to be a simple piece of equipment unrelated to eavesdropping, its presence added to the notion that a covert operation was underway. The day progressed with an eerie calm. By mid-afternoon, Carla finally opened the diner, though she kept the atmosphere subdued. She placed chairs a bit farther from windows, closed the blinds halfway, and moved carefully around her tasks. Regulars who came for lunch noticed the shift. The usual warmth of the diner's interior was replaced by a hushed vigilance. Everyone understood that the presence of criminals could manifest at any moment. Vin stepped in for a brief meal, ensuring Carla knew that he was still around. He took a seat by the far wall, from where he had a good view of the parking lot. He observed an unfamiliar vehicle pull in, an SUV with tinted windows. Two individuals emerged, wearing casual clothing but moving with the self-assured gait of people who dealt in shadows. They did not sport biker insignias, which raised the question of whether they were part of the same network or a rival faction. They entered the diner, scanning the tables, and took a booth near the entrance. Attention rippled through the few patrons present. These newcomers asked for menus in a subdued manner, and Carla handed them over without displaying her usual friendly smile. No one else in the diner spoke, though quiet glances were exchanged. Vin pretended not to notice them, focusing on the plate of food before him. From time to time, he studied the SUV outside, looking for any distinctive marks or modifications. After a silent meal, the two exited. One lingered near the cashier, possibly asking Carla questions. She shrugged politely, then resumed her duties. The pair left, climbing back into the SUV and driving off toward the highway that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Carla emerged from behind the counter moments later, appearing unsettled. Vin surmised that the strangers had inquired about the previous night's events or about who was coordinating efforts against the Silver Fangs. He sensed Carla's worry intensifying, as the circle of potential threats continued to expand. Night came with a blanket of stillness, interrupted only by the occasional thrum of a passing truck. A few watchers took up discreet positions, working in shifts that Vin had helped organize. They communicated through short messages, describing any movement around the lot or suspicious vehicles. Their vigilance was newly honed, shaped by the knowledge that the next major move by the Silver Fangs might be more direct and ruthless. In the motel's modest lobby, the manager switched off most of the lights, leaving only a dim lamp that cast faint shadows across outdated magazines and dusty brochures. Vin offered to keep an eye on the corridor leading to the rear exit, where someone could slip in unnoticed. He sat by a window, phone in hand, scanning various messages that watchers sent him. Reports indicated that local radio frequencies were full of static or strange bursts of noise, possibly from jammers. The bikers, or their backers, were clearly attempting to mask their activities. Shortly before midnight, a heavy engine sound rumbled through the lot. Vin tensed, expecting more motorcycles, but instead saw a large transport truck rolling in. Its trailer bore no company logos. Instead, it had a few lines of cryptic stenciling near the rear door. The driver parked at the far edge, away from the well-lit area of the pumps. The lights in the cab went dark. For an hour, nothing seemed to happen, yet Vin felt certain there was more to this arrival than a tired driver looking to rest. Eventually, a watcher stationed near the diner messaged that two figures had emerged from the sleeper cab and were pacing around the truck. One appeared to be on the phone, while the other checked beneath the trailer, tapping on something metallic. Their behavior suggested they were setting up or inspecting hidden cargo. Vin alerted the watchers to remain cautious, hoping to gather photographic evidence from a distance. He ventured outside, using the cover of darkness to approach from behind a row of parked cars. He glimpsed a flash of a small flashlight as the driver rummaged inside a panel near the trailer's axle. The second individual kept a lookout, scanning the deserted area. Vin crouched, holding his breath, every sense on high alert. He considered capturing video on his phone, but the faint glow from the screen might betray him. Instead, he recorded audio while keeping the device angled away. A moment later, the driver and lookout returned to the cab. The truck's engine started, but instead of driving off, they simply reparked the rig closer to the diner. Their shift in position hinted at a potential rendezvous with someone else. Vin retreated to maintain a broader vantage point, suspecting that additional vehicles might arrive soon. Nearly an hour later, another group of motorcycles approached, though not in the large formation seen before. Instead, four riders moved in single file, headlights off, navigating by the faint glow of the truck stop's scattered lights. They parked near the unmarked transport trailer. The watchers, maintaining silence, informed Vin of the bikers' actions. He inched closer, using the edge of the diner's dumpster enclosure for cover. Through the thin beams of the bikers' flashlights, he observed them engaging in a tense, low-voiced exchange with the driver. Though he could not hear every word, the posture of the men indicated they were discussing a transaction or a piece of vital cargo. Their glances darted around, betraying nervousness. One of the bikers patted the trailer's side, as if confirming that what he needed was inside. The driver slid open a small access panel on the trailer, revealing dark interior space. It was impossible to see what was stored there, but the conversation quickly took on a sense of urgency. Vin documented the scene by quietly snapping a few photos, mindful of any sudden shift in the group's attention. He guessed that the cargo might be narcotics or illegal weapons. The location was too strategic for a simple exchange of stolen goods. This had the markings of a carefully coordinated supply route, the very thing the Silver Fangs could exploit to maintain or expand their influence. One of the bikers tapped on the side of the trailer, perhaps signaling dissatisfaction with whatever was inside. The driver responded by gesturing at a piece of paper or a digital display. A second biker, standing slightly apart from the rest, watched the perimeter, resting one hand near the top of his vest. Vin guessed he was armed, ready to draw if he spotted intruders. The watchers observing from various corners remained hidden. The tension rose steadily as the minutes ticked by, every second an opportunity for discovery. The faint hiss of the desert wind played against the distant hum of a refrigerator unit attached to another parked trailer. The negotiations or transaction ended abruptly when the driver slammed the panel shut, climbed into the cab, and turned on the rig's engine. The four bikers briefly conferred among themselves, then started their motorcycles. The transport truck and the motorcycles left the premises almost simultaneously, heading down a side road that branched away from the main highway. Vin breathed a silent sigh of relief that no violent confrontation had erupted. He immediately sent messages to the watchers, instructing them to compile any footage or observations. Their small network had captured valuable data, which might help local or federal authorities unravel the scope of the Silver Fangs operations. Morning light brought new resolve. Carla, upon learning that unknown cargo had exchanged hands, grew visibly worried. She had already endured intimidation and threats. Now, the possibility of the truck stop being used for serious criminal shipments weighed heavily on her. The diner's business slowed to a trickle, as rumors spread among drivers who preferred to avoid any location under the influence of a criminal gang. Vin took time to speak with some of the watchers face to face, stressing the need for caution. Their presence, while helpful, could trigger retaliation if discovered. He made sure they understood the importance of relaying all evidence to law enforcement, possibly skipping over any local channels thought to be compromised. The watchers agreed but urged Vin to accelerate the search for higher-level support, given the mounting risk. He then decided to drive into a nearby city, about an hour away, where certain federal offices had branch locations. Along the desert highway, he mulled over the best approach to present the evidence without compromising the watchers' safety. The city was significantly larger than the dusty town near Desert Edge, bustling with midday traffic and dotted with government buildings. Parking a distance away from a federal annex, Vin entered and requested a meeting with someone in the division that handled organized crime. After a wait, he was directed to a junior officer who listened politely but seemed skeptical, possibly due to the countless tips that came through claiming knowledge of biker gangs or conspiracy theories. Vin remained steadfast, describing only the general situation without disclosing the watchers' identities or the location of Carla's diner. He handed over a flash drive containing partial evidence, photos of the unmarked transport, the conversation with the bikers, and snapshots of the suits who had arrived at the truck stop days earlier. The officer accepted the drive but did not promise immediate action. Vin sensed that bureaucracy and limited resources might hinder a swift response. Nevertheless, he left his contact information and stressed that a well-armed and well-connected group was exploiting a remote truck stop. On his way out, he overheard another staff member mentioning an ongoing investigation into cross-border trafficking rings, which gave him some measure of hope that the data might reach someone who cared. Returning to Desert Edge took longer than expected due to traffic and roadwork. The sun was dipping low by the time he arrived, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson. He noticed Carla standing outside the diner, talking with a small group of truckers who gestured heatedly toward the edges of the property. The watchers hung back, monitoring the discussion. Vin parked and approached. One of the truckers explained that a suspicious car had circled the truck stop multiple times that afternoon. Carla feared that someone was surveilling the area, possibly planning an attack at night. Some watchers felt they should coordinate a more public stance. Perhaps lighting the entire lot or parking trucks in a defensive ring. Others worried that such a display would provoke a direct confrontation. Vin noted the valid concerns on both sides. He suggested a measured approach, more cameras, better communication, but no overt aggression. The group dispersed to carry out these tasks, rigging extra lights and setting up makeshift tripods for phones or personal cameras. A few truckers agreed to keep their engines off and their cabs dark, so they might observe discreetly. Carla locked the diner earlier than usual, instructing her staff to stay home and out of harm's way. That evening, darkness enveloped Desert Edge with an almost suffocating presence. The truck stop felt both more fortified and more vulnerable. The watchers took their positions with a sense of solemn readiness. Vin walked the perimeter, recalling techniques he had learned from people he respected in law enforcement and the military, people who had shown him how to remain invisible while scanning for threats. The hours passed without incident, a silent standoff in the moonlit desert. Then, just when the watchers began to relax, a small explosion shattered the quiet. The sound came from the far side of the lot, near a rundown storage shed where surplus diner supplies were sometimes kept. A flash of bright light illuminated the perimeter fence, followed by the roar of flames licking at wooden walls. Chaos erupted as watchers rushed to extinguish the fire, alerting each other in hurried messages. Vin sprinted toward the blaze, suspecting that the Silver Fangs had set off a timed device or tossed an incendiary. The flames spread rapidly, feeding on old crates and spare parts stored inside the shed. The watchers formed a makeshift bucket line, and one of the truckers started his rig's engine to move it away from the fire, preventing any additional explosions. During the confusion, a group of bikers emerged from the darkness beyond the fence. They appeared at the edge of the flickering light, silhouetted by the flames. Vin noticed their aggressive stance. The watchers were occupied fighting the fire, leaving an opening for infiltration. Vin tried to signal to the closest watchers, but the roar of flames and running water drowned out his voice. He circled around a damaged section of the fence, reaching a vantage point where he could observe the bikers more closely. They seemed to be scanning the scene, possibly looking for a specific target or object. A few watchers eventually noticed them, prompting a tense standoff. Neither side moved. The watchers held no firearms, merely water buckets and tools they had grabbed to fight the flames, while the bikers stood as if waiting for an opportunity to strike. Sirens approached, presumably from the local fire department or deputies. The bikers melted back into the darkness, unwilling to confront official responders. The watchers continued their desperate efforts against the flames, which by now had mostly consumed the shed. By the time a small fire engine arrived, the structure was nearly a total loss, but the spread of the fire had been contained. Local deputies surveyed the damage, questioning whether anyone had seen the cause. Most of the watchers avoided implicating themselves, fearful that the bikers might retaliate if they learned who had witnessed the attack. A deputy made notes and tried to collect statements, but no one could provide a definitive report beyond hearing a small explosion. Vin lingered in the background, doubting that any official follow-up would amount to much. In the aftermath, Carla gazed at the smoldering remnants of the shed. She had lost supplies, and the property was further scarred. Yet a hardened look of determination settled on her face. The watchers felt a surge of shared resolve. The Silver Fangs had crossed another line by resorting to destructive tactics. It was now more apparent than ever that they intended to terrorize the truck stop into compliance or closure. Vin spent the rest of that night walking the perimeter with a few watchers who refused to leave until they were certain no secondary attacks were forthcoming. One of them found a piece of twisted metal near the fence line. Possibly part of a homemade incendiary device. Vin collected it, hoping it might be useful evidence for forensic analysis if the right agency ever took on the case. Tensions flared again the following day when new rumors circulated that certain local officials might be cooperating with the Silver Fangs. Some watchers claimed to have overheard a deputy telling a truck driver that Desert Edge should consider paying a fee to avoid trouble. Others mentioned seeing a county inspector suspiciously reclassifying the diner's building code status. Carla had not received an official notice yet, but the stage was set for bureaucratic harassment, another method of coercion. In response, Vin proposed that the watchers compile everything: photos, videos, the metal fragments from the incendiary, statements from truckers, and send it all in a secure batch to multiple agencies, including local news outlets. Though some watchers worried about the consequences of going public, others reasoned that exposure might provide protection, forcing authorities to act and preventing the Silver Fangs from operating in total secrecy. The group reached a fragile consensus. They spent hours organizing files and drafting cautious messages that described the intimidation, violence, and suspected trafficking routes, all without naming individuals who did not wish to be identified. Carla contributed receipts and logs that showed unusual visits from supposed inspectors. A few watchers offered dashcam footage capturing fragments of the bikers' nighttime arrivals. Vin volunteered to drive to a city in the opposite direction from his previous federal visit, ensuring the materials would be disseminated widely. As he prepared to leave, Carla handed him a sealed envelope containing what looked like personal notes or testimonies from local business owners who had also faced extortion. She gave him a grateful but haunted expression, one that conveyed both fear and trust. The journey to the second city took him through barren stretches of desert road, occasionally passing small towns battered by wind and time. He arrived at a modest media outlet, where he asked to speak with an investigative reporter. After a long wait, he met someone who showed genuine interest upon learning about the systematic intimidation at Desert Edge. Vin shared the compiled materials, underscoring that anonymity was crucial for many involved. The reporter promised to review the information and coordinate with relevant authorities. On his way back, Vin felt a cautious optimism. Although bureaucratic inertia remained a concern, a public spotlight might shift the balance. The Silver Fangs had operated in the shadows for too long, counting on the silence of frightened communities. If the story gained traction, their covert ties could unravel. The optimism faded, however, when he received a frantic message from one of the watchers. It contained only a few words, urging him to return as quickly as possible because more bikers had arrived, this time accompanied by unidentified vans with obscured license plates. The watchers feared an imminent escalation. Vin accelerated his vehicle across the desert highway, the sun dipping low once more. By the time he neared Desert Edge, twilight had settled, painting the sky with subdued shades of violet and orange. Far in the distance, he saw a cluster of headlights and heard the faint hum of engines. As he drew closer, it became obvious that the scale of the gathering was larger than any previous display of force. The Silver Fangs, along with their potential allies, had assembled around the perimeter of the truck stop like circling predators. He parked at a safe distance, stepping out to survey the scene. A sense of foreboding settled in his gut. The watchers' vehicles were scattered, some hidden behind the diner, others parked in strategic angles to shield them from direct assault. A few truckers had positioned their rigs in a defensive semicircle, headlights facing outward, effectively walling off part of the lot. At the center, near the pumps, stood 3 vans, doors open, revealing men who looked more like paramilitary operators than common criminals. They wore dark clothing, some with body armor, and carried themselves with a calculated calm. Clearly, the Silver Fangs were not acting alone. Someone with significant resources had joined forces, perhaps employing hired guns to ensure total compliance. Vin moved cautiously, keeping to the shadows. He recognized that this might be the moment everything either broke down into violence or transformed into a final push for justice. The watchers communicated via hushed texts, describing how the men in dark clothing had demanded entry to certain trucks, rummaging through them as if searching for specific items or verifying cargo. Some truckers had tried to resist but were physically overwhelmed or threatened with weapons. Carla and a few staff members were barricaded inside the diner. She had cut the lights, hoping to avoid drawing attention. Vin realized that the Silver Fangs might attempt to seize control of the diner as a symbolic show of dominance, and from there force any remaining truckers to submit. The entire atmosphere crackled with impending conflict. Suddenly, an additional wave of motorcycles arrived in a roar, forming a blockade at the truck stop's main entrance. The local roads, already sparsely patrolled, would offer little assistance now. The watchers who had prepared cameras and vantage points found themselves surrounded, uncertain whether it was safe to keep filming. Vin crept behind a line of stacked pallets near the back of the property, phone in hand, ready to capture any crucial evidence. With measured breaths, he scanned the scene for potential allies. The watchers were scattered, many pinned down by the threat of armed men prowling between the trucks. The paramilitary group had begun systematically clearing corners of the lot. One of them forced open the door of a parked trailer, while 2 more moved toward the diner's side entrance. He felt the urge to intervene directly, but the odds were grim. A direct confrontation in which the criminals held superior arms could lead to tragedy, putting innocent lives at risk. The better strategy was to wait for a small gap, an opportunity to distract or disrupt their operation. He also wondered whether any local or federal response was on its way, possibly alerted by the watchers or the truckers themselves. A tense standoff formed as a group of truckers, led by a burly man who seemed unafraid, blocked one of the paramilitary individuals from proceeding. The man demanded something, gesturing roughly in the direction of the trucks. The truckers refused to move, standing shoulder to shoulder. Though lacking weapons, their combined presence signaled they would not be easily cowed. One of the armed men stepped forward, raising a firearm in a clear intimidation tactic. The truckers froze, each likely recalculating how far they were willing to push. Vin, about 20 yards away, watched the confrontation intensify. He considered a quick diversion, perhaps causing a loud noise that might shift the paramilitary men's focus. However, another cluster of bikers lurked on the opposite flank. Any sudden movement might trigger live fire. In the diner, shadows flickered. Carla and her staff could be seen through the side window, crouched low, likely peering out. The paramilitary men had not yet broken in, possibly deterred by the possibility of an ambush. The entire truck stop lay in a fragile equilibrium, one spark away from chaos. Minutes ticked by like hours. Finally, an electronic wail broke the silence. Sirens approached, echoing over the desert. The paramilitary figures reacted with immediate alarm, signaling each other to regroup. The bikers also stirred with agitation, evidently not eager to risk a full-scale shootout with law enforcement arriving. Engines roared to life. The blockade at the entrance splintered as some bikers fled. The vans revved in unison, reversing away from the center and speeding off into the night, their open doors slamming shut in motion. The sight became a blur of commotion. The truckers who had stood firm scattered for cover, unsure whether the incoming sirens represented genuine help or something else. One paramilitary man, in a last show of intimidation, discharged a round into the air before vaulting into the back of a departing van. Vin ducked instinctively, adrenaline surging as the bullet cracked through the darkness. Moments later, a convoy of flashing lights pulled into Desert Edge, multiple sheriff's department vehicles and an unmarked SUV that might belong to an agency from the nearby city. Officers poured out, weapons raised, scanning for active threats. By then, most of the criminal element had vanished into the empty desert roads. The watchers emerged cautiously, some with footage on their phones, others trembling from the close call. Carla opened the diner door, eyes wide with a mixture of relief and unresolved fear. Deputies spread through the lot, taking statements from truckers, each reciting the harrowing details of the standoff. However, the uniformed officers seemed overwhelmed, uncertain how to proceed with so many scattered details and no suspects remaining on site. The unmarked SUV's occupants remained near their vehicle, speaking in low tones. Vin approached them, explaining that he had evidence and that he had already reached out to certain federal branches. They listened more attentively than local deputies had in the past, reviewing some of the images and video on his phone. One of them, who appeared to hold a supervisory role, quickly grasped that this was not an isolated biker gang problem, but a sophisticated operation involving contraband, intimidation, and possibly official collusion. For the next hour, the truck stop resembled a crime scene. Officers took photos of spent shell casings, measured tire tracks, and interviewed shaken witnesses. Carla remained near the diner, comforting staff members who were still in shock. Vin ensured the watchers spoke with the authorities who seemed trustworthy, carefully omitting their names from any official record if they so desired. The suiting men were gone, the paramilitary threat had receded, yet the underlying menace had not vanished. Everyone suspected that this was only a pause. The criminals would regroup somewhere beyond the desert horizon, recalibrating their strategy. The fact that so many had converged on Desert Edge indicated that the location was pivotal to their plans. Shutting down the diner or forcing Carla out would make it easier for them to move illegal goods without scrutiny. A deputy eventually approached Vin to confirm some details, noting that the confrontation had escalated far beyond typical local disputes. The deputy also mentioned that some local officials, including the sheriff, were now subject to internal review, prompted by the allegations of collusion or negligence. Vin felt a faint stir of hope that the wheels of accountability were finally in motion. By dawn, the police presence had thinned. Only a couple of vehicles remained, their occupants filling out reports. A hush descended upon the lot, battered by the wind that kicked up dust around scattered debris. The watchers huddled, exchanging phone numbers and vowing to stay vigilant. Carla returned to the diner's kitchen, where she brewed fresh coffee for a handful of truckers who had spent the entire night on edge. Vin took a moment to reflect. The arrival of law enforcement in greater numbers had prevented a bloodbath, but deeper efforts were needed to root out the elements that had emboldened the Silver Fangs and their associates. He recalled the flash drive he had given to that federal office and the meeting with the investigative reporter. Those seeds might bear fruit if enough people demanded answers and if higher authorities recognized the severity of the threat. A desert wind rattled a metal signpost, creating a hollow clang that echoed across the property. The watchers gradually dispersed to catch rest or resume driving, some reluctant to linger for fear of further attacks. Vin lingered, though, feeling that Desert Edge was now a focal point of a much larger struggle. He walked into the diner, past the overturned chairs and the staff who looked exhausted but relieved to be alive. He helped Carla clean up scattered debris near the entrance, piling broken glass and dirt into trash bags. She nodded in gratitude. But her eyes carried a sadness that no words could convey. Her livelihood, once a friendly refuge for weary travelers, had become a front line in a war she never asked for. The unstoppable momentum of that conflict weighed heavily on her shoulders. News trickled in from watchers who had spoken to local residents in the nearby town. Rumors circulated that a major figure in the region's criminal underworld was furious about the bungled operation at Desert Edge. Some believed it was the elusive Santiago, while others pointed to a figure known only by initials that had surfaced in coded radio chatter. Either way, the incident had exposed vulnerabilities on both sides. The criminals now knew the community would not roll over, and the community had glimpsed the scale of the threat. Over the next few days, the truck stop remained under intermittent surveillance by both law enforcement and suspicious vehicles that drifted by. Carla resumed partial business, though the diner never fully recovered the same spirit. Drivers were jittery, watchers always on high alert, scanning for the next wave of intimidation. Vin utilized that lull to coordinate further with investigators at the state and possibly federal level, emailing them a flood of details gathered since he first arrived. His messages grew more urgent. He emphasized that the presence of paramilitary enforcers indicated a level of organization beyond what a local biker gang could orchestrate. Cartels or large-scale trafficking syndicates might be involved, employing the Silver Fangs as a local enforcement arm. He warned that if authorities did not intervene decisively, the criminals could reassert control with even greater brutality. He also communicated with the investigative reporter, who hinted that a major exposé was in the works. Anonymous sources had corroborated the existence of a pipeline for illegal goods stretching across multiple states. Desert Edge was identified as a key junction, and the Silver Fangs served as one among several gangs that acted as gatekeepers. The reporter, however, needed more concrete evidence tying corrupt officials to the network. Vin pointed to the watchers' testimonies, the suspicious inspection visits, and the overheard threats that local businesses had described. As tension simmered, Vin found himself forging deeper bonds with some of the watchers. Many were everyday people who had discovered a shared resolve they never knew they possessed. Some had backgrounds in the military or law enforcement, while others were simply tired of cowering before lawless elements. They often met behind the diner, away from prying eyes, to discuss strategies for protecting each other and expanding their network. Quietly, they arranged for an even broader ring of cooperation, reaching out to truck stops in neighboring counties. Those who had connections in the freight industry spread the word about what was happening at Desert Edge, warning drivers to stay vigilant. The hope was that a united front of truckers across multiple rest stops might prevent the criminals from picking off each location individually. Carla, who was once hesitant to involve outsiders, began to encourage this collaboration. She realized that the more the region stood together, the harder it would be for the Silver Fangs to single out one truck stop or diner. She also spoke discreetly to local business owners in the nearby town, urging them to share any suspicious activity with the Watchers. Late one evening, as a soft moonlight bathed the desert, Vin strolled the perimeter with the older driver who had helped unify the truckers in the first place. The man remarked how improbable it was that a Hollywood figure had become central to their defense. Vin offered a faint smile, acknowledging that fame was irrelevant in a fight against those who wished to dominate through terror. Out near the broken fence where the incendiary device had been thrown, they discovered fresh tracks, motorcycle tires and footprints that appeared to circle the property. Whoever made them had likely been scoping out vulnerabilities for another attack. The Watchers took photos and shared them with the deputies, not confident it would lead to immediate results but unwilling to ignore the signs. An undercurrent of fear still pulsed through Desert Edge, yet a hardened spirit had taken root. Individuals who had once been mere bystanders were now actively engaged in safeguarding their community. In the process, they were also shining a light on the hidden networks that perpetuated crime throughout the region. The days of silent acquiescence were over, replaced by cautious defiance. Reports emerged of small skirmishes in nearby counties where other truck stops had begun resisting similar intimidation attempts. In some cases, local law enforcement cooperated with the Watchers, detaining a handful of gang members on charges unrelated to major trafficking. But those arrests chipped away at the facade of invincibility that the Silver Fangs had cultivated. Through it all, Vin maintained his quiet vigilance. He stayed in the cramped motel room, never straying too far, coordinating with Watchers and occasionally assisting Carla with her day-to-day operations in the diner. He recognized that a tipping point was approaching, a moment when external forces and internal resistance would either align to dismantle the Silver Fangs or fail, allowing the cycle of intimidation to continue. On one particularly scorching afternoon, a messenger arrived on foot. He was a young man, face hidden by a cap, delivering a crumpled note to Carla at the diner's entrance. He left as quickly as he came, refusing to answer any questions. Carla read it in silence, her expression growing grim. She walked over to Vin, pressing the paper into his hand. He unfolded it carefully, reading a brief, chilling threat. It demanded that everyone at Desert Edge vacate the premises within 72 hours. Any further defiance would result in severe consequences, naming Carla and certain Watchers specifically. The note was signed with a symbol resembling a stylized fang, confirming it was from the Silver Fangs or their associates. Carla's face showed the weight of many sleepless nights, of constant harassment and fear. Vin placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, though he knew words were insufficient. They had prepared for threats like this, but seeing it in writing struck a new nerve. The Watchers deserved to know, so the note was circulated among them. While it caused alarm, it also fueled anger. The group refused to surrender to scare tactics, choosing instead to fortify their resolve. Over the next 2 days, Watchers and local allies reinforced the truck stop as best they could, adding motion sensors, installing extra locks, and ensuring that no one moved alone, especially at night. Carla received calls from neighboring truck stop owners, some offering supplies and moral support, others urging her to flee while she still could. She wavered briefly, torn between self-preservation and her sense of duty to stand firm. In hushed conversations, the Watchers debated whether they should remain or evacuate. Vin reasoned that if Desert Edge fell into the Silver Fangs' hands, it would become a major pipeline for everything from narcotics to human trafficking. The criminals would claim victory, sending a ripple of fear across the region. Yet if they stayed, the note made it clear that violence was imminent. Despite the oppressive heat and the looming threat, they decided to stand. They would trust in the growing body of evidence they had gathered, the alliances they had formed, and the seeds of interest sown in law enforcement and media circles. The 72-hour deadline served as a countdown to a confrontation. No one knew precisely what form it would take or whether law enforcement could intervene in time, but they prepared for every scenario they could imagine. The final night before the deadline, a hush settled over Desert Edge unlike any prior calm. Truck traffic was almost non-existent, as word had spread that the area was under siege. The watchers kept vigil behind tinted windows and darkened corridors, scanning for any unusual movement. Carla and her remaining staff stayed in the diner's break room, refusing to lock themselves away entirely but keeping well clear of doors and windows. Vin remained outside, leaning against the side of a parked rig, eyes surveying the horizon. Somewhere out there, an assembly of bikers and paramilitary allies might be gathering, waiting for their moment to deliver on the written threat. He was reminded of a scene from one of his own films, but this situation lacked stunt coordinators and safety nets. The bullets would be real, and the stakes far greater than box office receipts. He closed his eyes, steadying his breathing. He thought about the people who had placed their faith in him, a Hollywood star who had arrived by chance at a lonely truck stop in the desert. He thought about Carla and her unwavering devotion to the business she had built, and the watchers who refused to let criminals dictate how they lived. Above all, he felt the weight of the desert night pressing in, as if the entire land held its breath for the inevitable clash. At some indistinct hour, he caught a faint glimmer of headlights in the distance. It was too soon to tell if they belonged to the law enforcement he had tried so hard to rally or the criminals determined to overrun Desert Edge. Tension coiled in his stomach like a spring. Another quiet message from one of the watchers signaled that movement had been detected near the eastern fence line. Vin crouched low, weaving through the shadows toward a vantage point. This was the decisive moment, the threshold between fearful anticipation and the reality of confrontation. In that silent crossing, he realized that no matter the outcome, Desert Edge and everyone within it would be forever changed by what was about to unfold. Vin Diesel crouched in the darkness behind a scuffed metal dumpster, peering past the corner of a parked trailer. From this angle, he could see the silhouettes of multiple men advancing under the cover of the desert night. Their profiles were faintly illuminated by the distant headlights of vehicles on the highway, and by sporadic moonlight that cast shifting shadows across the dusty lot. The watchers who had been alerted by the quiet radio messages prepared themselves in tense silence. Their nerve endings felt raw, as if each breath of dry air rattled through their bodies like a warning. This, Vin realized, was the critical hour. For days, the Silver Fangs, and whoever funded or supported them, had made multiple attempts to seize or sabotage Desert Edge. They had unleashed intimidation, property damage, infiltration, even a small incendiary device that destroyed part of the property. Now, with the 72-hour ultimatum expired, they had apparently chosen a direct assault. He motioned to one of the watchers tucked behind a row of stacked tires to remain still. They had a small vantage that overlooked the eastern fence line, where movement was reported a few minutes earlier. Sure enough, through the chain-link fence's gaps, dark shapes flickered, men crouching low and passing equipment to one another. The watchers had placed motion sensors earlier in the day, but whether these intruders had neutralized them or chosen a blind spot remained unclear. Vin tried to recall the layout of the truck stop's perimeter, fences in moderate condition, some sections more vulnerable than others. He and Carla's supporters had done what they could, reinforcing gates, installing extra lighting, but the criminals were resourceful. If they'd studied the property for weaknesses, they would know exactly where to breach without being easily spotted. A faint rustle of movement came from the opposite side of the lot. Vin stiffened, realizing the Silver Fangs were approaching from multiple directions. Their numbers were uncertain, possibly more than during any previous incursion. Meanwhile, a cluster of watchers waited inside the diner with Carla, ready to barricade the doors if the gang tried to storm it. Another small group of watchers occupied vantage points near the shipping containers behind the diner, prepared to document every step. Minutes dragged. The hush was so profound that the scuttling of a stray desert creature across the asphalt sounded unnaturally loud. Vin's heart pounded steadily. In another era, he might have been on a film set, choreographing such tension with pyrotechnics and blank rounds, but reality had no margin for error. Here, the consequences were unthinkably real. Suddenly, a blinding flash erupted near the southern fence line. It tore through the night, followed by the echoing thud of a small explosion. Several watchers stifled gasps. The light revealed a group of figures crouching near the fence. One man waved his arm forward, directing at least 4 others to advance. Their approach was disciplined, reminiscent of paramilitary units rather than a ragtag biker gang. The watchers near the southern sector scrambled to reposition themselves. Vin ducked behind the dumpster as a volley of gunshots cracked across the lot, muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the chaos. It was unclear who fired first, but each shot reverberated off the metal siding of trailers and the cinderblock walls of the diner. Carla's employees, huddled inside, pressed themselves to the floor. A second squad of attackers forced open a segment of fence on the eastern perimeter. They began slipping inside, hugging the shadows of parked rigs to keep from being seen. The watchers on that side attempted to record video with handheld cameras, but the fear of stray bullets made them cautious. Over the shortwave channel that some watchers carried, frantic whispers confirmed that these intruders were better equipped than any group the Silver Fangs had sent before. Vin peered out from his hiding spot and saw at least 6 individuals wearing body armor, their faces partially obscured by balaclavas. They carried compact rifles or shotguns, maintaining a tight formation. This was no simple intimidation squad, it was a full-scale assault. He felt a surge of urgency. The diner, containing Carla and some staff, would be their prime target. If they took control of it, the entire truck stop would effectively be under their dominion. Crawling low across the gravel, he reached the side of a smaller storage unit that hadn't been burned in the earlier fire. Another watcher was crouched there, an older man clutching an improvised baton. The watchers were not heavily armed, most possessed only basic tools, or at best, personal sidearms. They never intended an all-out firefight. Their strategy had always hinged on gathering overwhelming evidence and pressuring authorities to dismantle the gang. But the criminals had apparently decided that brutal force would secure their objectives faster than any negotiation. Far in the distance, a siren wailed, but it was faint, perhaps too far to matter. The watchers had dialed every available number to warn the local sheriff's department and any state troopers, but response times in the desert could be slow. Moreover, infiltration of law enforcement by corrupt elements could delay or divert help. The watchers were effectively on their own until proven otherwise. Gunfire rattled again. A bullet ricocheted off a metal post, sending sparks. Vin pressed himself against the wall, heart pounding. He realized they needed a diversion to keep the attackers from quickly overwhelming the diner. Reaching into the pocket of his jacket, he found a small device, an emergency flare and whistle combo. It wasn't much, but it could draw the attention of the assailants if used correctly. The older watcher nodded at Vin. They edged around the storage unit, braving a momentary exposure to line up a shot with the flare. Vin ignited it, sending a streak of bright red light arc over the truck stop's parking area. The hiss and illumination were abrupt, painting the asphalt in a deep crimson glow. Several intruders spun toward the flare's source, startled. In that second of confusion, watchers on the southwestern side seized the moment to reposition behind a row of trucks. Some used the corner of a box trailer as cover, snapping photos or brief video clips of the armed men. Others simply tried to keep the aggressors pinned down with sporadic return fire, though they lacked the range and firepower of the paramilitary group. Meanwhile, Carla and 2 staff members barricaded the diner's main doors, shoving heavy tables and chairs against them. She could hear the staccato of combat outside, each shot sending a jolt through her. In a trembling hand, she clutched her phone, scanning for any response to her frantic calls. So far, only an automated message from the sheriff's department had replayed, assuring her that help was on the way. At the eastern flank, more armed men slinked between parked rigs, some shining flashlights under the trailers as though searching for watchers. One of them kicked over an old metal barrel, sending a thunderous clang that made watchers jump in fear. Another attacker tried to slash open the side of a tractor trailer with a heavy knife, perhaps believing someone was concealed inside. Vin recognized the risk. If this turned into a chaotic firefight, innocents could be injured or killed, and the diner might be torched or seized in the process. Worse still, the criminals could vanish before any law enforcement arrived, leaving little but wreckage. Gathering his nerves, he keyed a short message into his phone for the watchers: "Keep your distance. Focus on evidence and containment. Avoid direct confrontation if possible." Several watchers received the text, though sporadic coverage meant not everyone saw it in time. A wave of confusion rippled through the scene as intruders pressed forward, apparently realizing they faced limited resistance. 2 watchers near the chain-link fence were forced to retreat when a paramilitary figure advanced with a weapon raised. Then, from behind the diner, an unexpected roar of engines cut through the night. A half-dozen trucks revved to life, headlights blazing. It was a group of truckers who had, until now, remained silent behind the building, waiting for a critical chance to act. Their trucks lurched forward in a near-synchronized surge, forming a rolling barrier that hemmed in the attackers' eastern entry point. The paramilitary men there scattered to avoid being pinned between 2 of the trailers. That coordinated display stalled the assault on the diner, buying precious minutes. Some watchers continued capturing footage, hoping the presence of so many large vehicles would force the criminals to think twice. The engines were deafening, spotlights beaming into the eyes of the attackers and drowning them in glare. A few of them, outmaneuvered and disoriented, unleashed haphazard gunshots, forcing the truckers to duck behind their doors. Vin used the confusion to slip around the far edge of the property, aiming to secure the diner's side entrance. If the attackers made it inside, Carla and her staff would be trapped. Dodging between scattered debris, he spotted 2 armed figures creeping toward the diner's rear exit. They each wore dark tactical vests and carried rifles. Their approach was slow, methodical, suggesting some level of training. Pressing his back against the diner's outer wall, Vin steadied his breathing. He had no illusions about being a real-life action hero, but he did have confidence in his ability to stay calm and seize opportunities. As one intruder reached for the door handle, Vin grabbed a length of metal pipe left near a toolbox. Timing his move with precision, he swung it at the man's rifle barrel. The impact echoed in the enclosed space, forcing the man's weapon downward and causing him to fire a shot into the dirt. The other attacker spun in surprise, but Vin instinctively drove an elbow into his side. Both men stumbled, evidently not expecting immediate resistance from behind. Vin struck again, connecting with the first man's torso, dislodging the rifle from his grip. The second intruder tried to raise his own gun, but Vin slammed him against the wall. Seizing a fleeting advantage, Vin kicked the first man's weapon farther away. The second attacker managed to twist free, and for a moment, they locked eyes in a tense standoff. Then, a beam of light burst onto the scene. One of the watchers had arrived, flashlight in hand, capturing everything on camera. The sudden light disoriented the attacker, giving Vin the opening to knock the rifle from his grasp. Both men, unarmed and cornered, tried to flee. One dashed around the side of the diner, the other stumbled toward the parking area. The watcher aimed the flashlight after them, shouting for others to help. Vin pulled open the diner door, where Carla stood just behind the barricade. She looked at him in startled relief, quickly unlocking the makeshift blockade so he could slip inside. Before Carla could utter a word, a hail of bullets ripped through one of the diner's windows, sending shards of glass across the floor. Everybody dropped down, hearts pounding in their ears. Someone outside was firing wildly in an attempt to force compliance. The watchers who had ringed the back entrance were forced to scatter. Crouched behind the counter, Carla clenched her teeth as the lights overhead flickered. Vin motioned for everyone to stay low. The watchers inside had no real firepower, just phones and a few blunt tools. But the attackers, now engaged in multiple skirmishes around the lot, seemed unable to coordinate a swift takeover of the diner. The unexpected resilience, trucks forming barricades, watchers documenting everything, and pockets of resistance, had slowed their advance. Moments later, the wail of sirens grew audible. This time, it wasn't just a single squad car. From the diner's shattered window, Vin spotted at least 3 sets of flashing lights racing up the highway. The paramilitary men realized help was inbound. They had little time to complete their mission or to extract themselves safely. Most watchers remained hidden, but some took advantage of the criminals' sudden urgency to capture closer footage. Under the shaky glow of phone cameras, they recorded the attackers' attempts to pull back from the fence line, dragging one injured comrade who clutched his shoulder. A couple of them hoisted crates that might contain weapons or contraband, shoving them into the back of a dark SUV waiting near the eastern exit. Amid the chaos, gunfire tapered off. The approaching sirens signaled that the criminals could no longer operate with impunity. They scrambled to regroup, their plan foiled by the unanticipated scale of local resistance and the arrival of backup. Bike engines roared to life near the outer road. Vehicles squealed out of the lot, engines revving into the desert night. At least one van was left behind, its doors flung open. A watcher's phone camera captured the silhouette of a man tossing something from the van before sprinting away. Moments later, that man dove onto the back of a departing motorcycle. Dust clouds billowed as the group fled. Seconds later, a convoy of sheriff's cruisers and a couple of unmarked vehicles thundered onto the property. It was the most substantial police presence Desert Edge had seen. Deputies jumped out, commanding anyone armed to drop their weapons. They quickly surrounded the diner, uncertain who might be inside. A voice boomed through a loudspeaker, instructing the watchers and staff to step out slowly with their hands visible. Vin peeked over the counter. He signaled Carla and her employees that it was finally safe to comply. They inched toward the front entrance, pushing aside the barricade. Outside, the watchers did the same, emerging from behind rigs and crates, arms raised to show they posed no threat. Flashlights bobbed across the parking lot, revealing bullet holes, shattered glass, and scattered equipment left by the attackers. A handful of deputies rushed to secure the abandoned van. One found suspicious crates inside, likely containing illegal weapons or contraband. Another officer spotted the rifle that Vin had kicked away near the diner's rear door. Gradually, the watchers explained to the stunned officers what had transpired: a full-scale assault by a heavily armed force likely connected to the Silver Fangs and a larger syndicate. The local sheriff, who arrived in one of the unmarked cars, wore an expression of grim concern. This was no longer a matter of petty intimidation or broken windows. The scene resembled a small war zone, with bullet casings littering the ground. Ambulances were called, though preliminary checks suggested only minor injuries among watchers. The criminals, if injured, had taken their wounded with them in their escape. As dawn crept over the horizon, additional law enforcement vehicles trickled in, state troopers, more deputies, and a few individuals in suits who might have been federal agents. They began cataloging evidence, the metal fragments from the earlier explosions, the crates left in the van, and the bullet-riddled vehicles. The watcher supplied videos and photos, some from high vantage points, which captured the paramilitary men in clear detail. The diner filled with officers methodically questioning everyone, from Carla to the truckers who had parked their rigs as barricades. Tensions were high, but the presence of so many uniforms brought at least a measure of relief. Vin noticed one of the watchers quietly explaining to a pair of federal agents about the infiltration tactics, the forced inspections, and the repeated attempts to seize control of the truck stop. The agents took notes, murmuring that they might have broader investigations underway. Over the next several hours, the once chaotic parking lot transformed into a scrutinized crime scene. Yellow tape marked off bullet impact sites, shattered glass, and the area where the fence was breached. Investigators dusted for fingerprints on abandoned rifles. Others meticulously opened the crates found in the van, discovering an array of high-caliber weapons and, disturbingly, bundles of suspicious packages that could be narcotics. A flurry of activity turned Desert Edge into a hotbed of official interest. News of the standoff spread quickly among local reporters. Within a day, camera crews began arriving, carefully avoiding the taped-off areas. They interviewed anyone willing to speak, including some watchers whose footage was already going viral on social media. Carla, exhausted but resolved, confirmed that she had suffered months of intimidation before this outright attack. She expressed gratitude that no lives were lost, but warned that the threat remained. Vin kept a low profile during the press arrivals, not eager to overshadow the community's struggle with his celebrity. He did, however, speak privately to certain law enforcement officials, providing details about the clandestine meetings, the infiltration attempts by phony inspectors, and his own observations of the paramilitary approach. Most investigators reacted with a mix of alarm and curiosity, leading him to suspect that the scale of criminal organization behind the Silver Fangs was bigger than anyone had previously admitted. In the days following, a more structured operation began to unfold. State authorities collaborated with federal agents to identify the men captured on the watchers' videos. The clear snapshots of faces, patches, weapons, and even partial license plates formed a trove of evidence. Carla continued to supply them with receipts, logs, and the testimonies of truckers who had faced extortion at the diner. The watchers, once merely a loose network of everyday people, found themselves hailed as local heroes. Their vigilance and willingness to document the aggression made it nearly impossible for any complicit official to sweep the incident under the rug. Some watchers who had backgrounds in technology set up a secure online repository of all the evidence, ensuring it wouldn't be lost or manipulated. Yet even amid the influx of law enforcement attention, Desert Edge remained on edge. The Silver Fangs had melted into the desert night, but no one believed they were truly gone. The paramilitary unit had also disappeared, possibly regrouping in another distant outpost. There lingered a sense of dread that these criminal forces would either come back with a vengeance or strike at softer targets in the surrounding region. Carla reopened the diner with limited hours, guarded by a small contingent of uniformed officers. She found herself warily greeting a surge of visitors, some curious onlookers, others well-wishers eager to support a local business that had become a symbol of defiance. She was grateful for the renewed interest but felt uneasy that such publicity might once again paint a target on her establishment. In the midst of all this, a surprising message arrived on Vin's phone. The investigative reporter he had spoken to a while back was publishing a major piece about the infiltration of remote truck stops by organized crime. The reporter had linked the Silver Fangs to an expansive smuggling ring that spanned at least 4 states. Law enforcement crackdowns were already happening at certain identified hubs. Vin quietly celebrated the development, hopeful that this broader coverage would force deeper investigations, arrests, and dismantling of the syndicate's support network. A few nights later, as the chaos gradually subsided, Vin took a solitary walk around the truck stop's perimeter. Cleanup efforts had removed most of the debris, but bullet holes and scorch marks still marred various surfaces. He paused by the remains of the collapsed shed that had been burned weeks prior. The boards were now reduced to char, with twisted metal rods jutting out like skeletal remains. He couldn't help but reflect on the improbable journey that led him here, a famous actor on a quiet road trip, stumbling upon a community under siege. He thought about how close Desert Edge had come to being overtaken. The combined courage of watchers, truckers, and Carla's quiet determination had held the line until outside forces finally intervened. The next morning brought a more comforting scene. A few truckers, veterans of that tense standoff, parked their rigs without fear. They chatted with each other in the diner, sipping coffee, discussing routes and freight schedules. Carla, though still fatigued, managed a subdued smile as she refilled mugs. Behind the counter, new security cameras had been installed, streaming footage directly to off-site backups. One of the federal agents investigating the assault, an individual named Agent Martinez, approached Vin outside the diner. He was a tall, serious man wearing plain clothes and a badge clipped to his belt. Quietly, he thanked Vin for facilitating the evidence and for coordinating the watchers' efforts. Martinez explained that the crates in the van had contained a mix of illegal firearms and high-grade narcotics, consistent with large-scale trafficking rings. He also mentioned that some local officials implicated in corruption had abruptly resigned or had been taken into custody for questioning. Vin asked about the paramilitary unit and the possible mastermind behind them, a figure rumored to be named Santiago or to be working on behalf of a broader cartel. Martinez spoke cautiously, acknowledging that multiple gangs and cartels used biker groups as frontline enforcers. The official investigations, he said, would go higher and deeper than the immediate region. There was every chance that the battered but still defiant Desert Edge had played a pivotal role in exposing a multi-state network. Despite those encouraging words, the aftermath lingered. New watchers from neighboring towns began arriving to compare notes. Some local business owners who had endured threats came forward, emboldened by the crackdown. They offered sworn statements to the county prosecutor, describing years of harassment. Carla watched it all unfold, torn between relief and exhaustion. In the ensuing days and weeks, the presence of law enforcement remained strong, though a few watchers worried it would fade once media coverage shifted to another story. Vin spent time ensuring that all videos and photos were backed up in multiple places, forging a chain of accountability that even the most corrupt officials would find difficult to break. Slowly, the everyday rhythm of the truck stop returned. Long-haul drivers once again felt safe enough to park overnight. Carla reopened the diner for extended hours, and the staff, though still cautious, tried to restore a welcoming atmosphere. Some watchers formed an official neighborhood watch group in conjunction with state troopers, setting up a permanent network to report suspicious activities along the highways. On a warm afternoon, when the sun hung low over the desert plain, Carla finally took a break. She left one of her staff in charge and walked outside to the lot, where Vin was adjusting a newly installed floodlight near the side of the diner. She appeared more at ease than he had ever seen her, a subtle relief etched across her face. They didn't need words to acknowledge the distance they had traveled from desperation to a semblance of safety. Later that same evening, some watchers and truckers gathered quietly behind the diner, sipping sodas and coffees. The conversation drifted to the idea that Desert Edge was now a symbol. Proof that a seemingly powerless community could disrupt criminal networks by standing together. They talked about how other truck stops across the region were implementing similar tactics, sharing information, refusing intimidation, calling out corruption. Vin lingered on the periphery of that group, listening. He felt an odd sense of fulfillment that surpassed any blockbuster movie premiere. He saw people who, once isolated and frightened, had discovered a collective voice. Though scars remained, they had forged an alliance that would outlast any single group of criminals. By the end of that week, official indictments were announced. Law enforcement held a press conference detailing charges against dozens of suspects associated with the Silver Fangs, extortion, arms trafficking, racketeering, and attempted murder. Some of those men had been identified through watchers' videos, corroborated by ballistic evidence from the final assault. A separate investigation pointed to a web of corrupt local officials who had either turned a blind eye to the gang's activities or actively facilitated them. At last, the story found national attention in certain media outlets. Journalists visited Desert Edge, filming the diner's broken window, still boarded up, and interviewing Carla, who chose her words carefully, worried that gloating could spark renewed vengeance. She thanked her staff, the watchers, and the law enforcement agents who eventually responded in force. Local truckers also shared their accounts of the harrowing stand they had taken that night. Vin was approached multiple times for interviews, but he politely declined. He explained that the real story belonged to the people of Desert Edge, who had risked everything. When pressed by a persistent reporter, he simply said that he'd come here for solitude and found something far more important, an example of how ordinary folks could unite against intimidation. His few succinct statements, however, still made the rounds on social media, leading fans worldwide to express admiration for his low-key efforts. Days turned into weeks. The area settled into a cautious peace. Carla completed repairs on the diner's windows, and the shattered pieces of glass were replaced by sturdier panes. Bullet marks on a few trailers remained, silent reminders of the violent confrontation that almost consumed Desert Edge. A sense of normalcy, albeit tinged with vigilance, returned to the truck stop. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Carla closed up the diner, escorted by a small group of watchers who insisted on ensuring she made it home safely. Vin ambled around the parking lot one last time, noticing how the newly installed floodlights cast broad arcs across the asphalt. The place no longer felt like a stage for fear but like a well-guarded waypoint for the countless drivers crossing the southwest. He stopped by the motel, where the same squeaking sign still flickered, noticing the manager chatting with a deputy. Two watchers sat on a bench nearby, scanning the open highway for unusual headlights. Vin approached them, offering a nod that conveyed both respect and farewell. They thanked him, expressing gratitude for his part in bringing attention, and eventual reinforcements, to Desert Edge. Quietly, he settled his motel bill and placed his packed bag in the trunk of his car. Though the road had more to offer him, he knew his presence here had served its purpose. The watchers, the truckers, and Carla had found their collective strength. Federal investigations would continue unraveling the broader criminal network, and more arrests were likely in the pipeline. With each day, the shockwaves of that final assault reverberated through communities that once believed they had no choice but to yield. Before dawn, Vin Diesel drove away from the truck stop, the desert wind sweeping behind him as if wishing him safe travels. In his rearview mirror, the neon sign for Carla's diner glowed faintly. This place, which had become a crucible of fear and resilience, was receding into the distance, yet it would remain a defining chapter in his life. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, more profound than any standing ovation or red carpet premiere. Desert Edge no longer needed a lone wanderer. It had become its own fortress of resolve, guarded by people who now understood the power of standing united. As the open highway stretched ahead, Vin carried with him the knowledge that communities, when roused to defend what they love, can overcome even the most formidable threats. Sunlight gradually broke over the horizon, painting the desert in gold and orange. The road bent toward new territory, new faces, and fresh challenges. He breathed in the promise of a different day. Far behind him, Desert Edge continued to thrive and rebuild, an enduring testament to the might of everyday heroes, and a reminder to all who might try to tear them down that they would never be conquered so easily again.